My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 62 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed I had mastered the quiet art of balance, balancing work and marriage, responsibility and rest, personal boundaries and family generosity. After 40 years in corporate finance, I recently transitioned into a consulting role, finally earning enough to breathe without counting every breath. When I received my annual performance bonus, $65,000, I felt something I hadn't felt since my 30s, the comfort of knowing I could choose something for myself. My husband, Daniel, and I have been married for 22 years. He is kind and soft-spoken, a gentle soul shaped by a childhood where his parents leaned more on him than he ever leaned on them. There's a difference between family and obligation, but Daniel was raised to believe the two were identical. His parents, Nora and Frank, were always just getting by. Their emergencies appeared with remarkable frequency, almost seasonal in nature. A broken transmission, a roof leak, a sudden medical bill, a surprise tax error, it was always something. I used to offer help willingly, because that's what families do. But with time I learned that their emergencies typically lined up with vacations they deserved, gadgets they needed, or mistakes they insisted could happen to anyone. Still, Daniel loved them. And I loved Daniel. So I tried to make peace with their needs, even when their needs felt like demands. This year, though, I wanted my bonus for something different. My oldest friend, Clara, and I had been planning a trip across the Scottish Highlands. Nothing extravagant, just two older women revisiting the dreams we'd postponed for marriages, children, careers, and everyone else's needs. I pictured myself standing on a cliff overlooking the sea, tasting cold air, hearing quiet. A chapter for me. A gift to myself. I told Daniel about the bonus the evening I received it. He smiled, genuinely proud. But I noticed something else flicker through his expression. Not greed. Not envy. Just worry. He didn't say why. I didn't press him. 2 days later, that flicker revealed itself. Nora called at 7:30 in the morning. A tone of wide-eyed urgency only she could deliver. I heard Daniel's voice from the kitchen. Soft, apologetic, cornered. Then he came to me, rubbing the back of his neck like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. He said they needed help. Something about medical tests and a sudden home repair. He kept saying he didn't want to ask me. I told him we could talk about it, because that was all I could say before my coffee. But his anxiety lingered in the air like a low, humming engine. I didn't yet know that my bonus was already gone. I didn't yet know that the moment I dreamed of, finally choosing something for myself, was already slipping through fingers I hadn't even closed around it. I didn't yet know that what they took, I would eventually take back. Calmly, precisely, and with legal interest applied. What I did know even then, was this. Families don't destroy trust all at once. They erode it. A grain at a time. And I was about to learn just how much erosion had happened while I'd been trying to be kind. The day I discovered the truth, it wasn't with shouting or some dramatic confrontation. It was with a quiet, accidental glance. Daniel had left his laptop open on the dining table. Not unusual. He used it to track bills and manage his parents' appointments. But as I passed by, a notification flashed across the screen. An email thread with his mother. The subject line read, "Transfer complete. Thank you, sweetie." I normally respect his privacy, but something about that line sank its claws into me. I didn't touch the keyboard. I didn't scroll. The preview alone delivered the blow. Nora had written, "Tell Margaret thank you again for understanding. We couldn't have made it without that money. We'll pay back what we can, but you know how things are." My breath froze. What money? The number stared at me in the second preview line. $65,000. I stepped back as if the laptop had burned me. Daniel came into the room moments later, humming lightly, as though the ground beneath our lives hadn't shifted. I asked, carefully, calmly, what Nora's email meant. His face drained of color. He confessed in fragments, stumbling over his own guilt. 2 days earlier, right after I shared my bonus, his parents had called him in tears. They said they were drowning, that they might lose their house, that medical bills were stacking so quickly they couldn't breathe. They begged him not to burden me with it. And Daniel, the boy who had been raised to patch every hole in their world, had done what he always did. He fixed it. Except it wasn't his money. It was mine. He transferred my entire bonus into Nora and Frank's account without asking me, without discussing it, without giving me even the dignity of choice. I listened without interrupting. Silence is a powerful tool. People tell more truth when they're trying to fill silence than when they're being interrogated. He kept saying he was sorry, that he meant to replace it, that he thought he could handle it quietly so I wouldn't worry. But it wasn't worry he took away. It was autonomy. The betrayal didn't scream. It whispered. I told him I needed some air and went into the backyard. The winter sun cast long shadows over the grass. Calm, indifferent, steady. And in that stillness, I felt something inside me shift from wounded to resolute. It wasn't Nora and Frank who had stolen the money. They had asked, as they always did. It was Daniel who had given it to them. Without me. Without a word. And if they thought I would simply accept it, they were about to learn that $65,000 was not a gift. It was a loan. And I knew exactly how to collect. To understand why this betrayal cut so deeply, I need to explain something about Daniel's family. You see, some parents raise their children to be independent. Others raise them to be dependent. And then there are parents like Nora and Frank, who raise their child to be their safety net. Daniel grew up with the belief that he was the only functional adult in the household. Nora projected fragility. Every inconvenience became a crisis, every mistake followed by tears or guilt-laced silence. Frank was detached, passive, almost allergic to responsibility. So Daniel became the stabilizing force. That dynamic didn't magically shift when he grew up. Instead, they adapted it. Whenever life demanded accountability, they turned to their son. And because Daniel equated helping with love, he always answered the call. When I entered the picture decades later, their expectations simply expanded to include me. At first, I didn't mind. Emergencies happen. Life requires generosity. But the pattern became hard to ignore. Each request came cloaked in last-minute urgency. Each one required Daniel to rescue them. And each one stretched our finances a little thinner. The first few years of marriage, I tried gently setting limits. Nora would respond with passive-aggressive gratitude. Frank would send rambling texts about how families stick together. Daniel would stand between us, a man torn between the woman he married and the parents who had shaped him. I never wanted to make him choose. But years of unchecked dependency create a dangerous expectation. Entitlement. They believed they had access to Daniel's resources. Daniel believed he had a responsibility to give. And now he believed he could use my resources, because in his eyes, ours and mine no longer had a line between them. But for me, autonomy has always been sacred. When you grow up scraping by, every decision you earn feels like a small miracle. I worked for decades climbing a ladder that seemed greased at every rung. I saved. I planned. I nurtured discipline like a survival skill. My first marriage had taught me painful lessons about finances and trust. My ex-husband spent us into debt, hiding credit cards, making promises he never kept. When I rebuilt my life, I promised myself I would never again allow someone to handle my money without transparency. Daniel knew that. He knew. And yet, here we were. As I sat with memories of my own past, of hard-earned stability, of a life rebuilt from disaster, I understood something painfully clear. This wasn't about the money. This was about boundaries that had been eroded, tested, and finally crossed. I had tried kindness. I had tried patience. I had tried compromise. Now it was time for clarity. And clarity, when delivered calmly, can be more powerful than rage. I began making a plan. A legal, ethical, irrefutable plan. A plan that would teach Nora and Frank the value of what they had taken. And teach Daniel the value of what he had risked. What they all failed to realize was this: I am not a woman who tolerates financial betrayal. I am a woman who documents it. Before I made a move, I needed facts. Precise facts. Because truth is strongest when backed by evidence. While Daniel slept restlessly that night, I sat in my home office under the warm glow of the reading lamp and pulled every statement, every transfer record, every email. I didn't hack anything. I didn't snoop out of malice. Daniel had used our joint account. I had full legal access. And his parents had emailed him with no password protection. The digital trail was remarkably clean. On Tuesday morning at 9:14 a.m., Daniel had transferred exactly $65,000 from our account to Nora and Frank. Attached to the memo section were the words, "For bills." No specifics. No documentation from them. No agreements. Nothing. I then looked at their bank statements, which Daniel had access to for helping with budgeting. What I found was infuriating, but not surprising. Of that $65,000, $12,000 had gone to an upscale spa in Sedona, $9,500 for a down payment on a new SUV, $4,800 for a week-long cruise, $2,300 on designer luggage. The rest was scattered across restaurants, gadgets, and miscellaneous purchases. This wasn't a family emergency. It was a shopping spree. A spree funded by my hard work and my dreams. I printed everything. 5 complete sets of documentation. Organized. Chronological. Labeled. As I assembled the binder, something inside me grew steadier, calmer. Anger gave way to purpose. People often underestimate women my age. They confuse calm with weakness. But calm is simply controlled fire. The next step was due diligence. I contacted a financial mediator, someone neutral, someone who specialized in family disputes. Not to punish, but to formalize. I explained the situation, shared the documentation, and asked one question. What is the cleanest legal path to treat this transfer as a loan? He told me exactly what to do. I drafted a repayment agreement with clear language, structured monthly payments, and 5% annual interest. Very modest compared to the legal maximum, but symbolic. A rate that said, this was not a gift. This was debt. And then I added one clause. In the event of non-payment, the lender reserves the right to pursue civil recovery through standard legal channels. Professional. Impersonal. Bulletproof. I made 2 copies. One for them. One notarized as mine. The next morning, I asked Daniel to meet me in the living room. His shoulders were slumped, eyes red from lack of sleep. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. I need to speak with your parents, I said. Tonight. Here. He nodded, defeated. As he walked away, I felt a mix of sorrow and resolve. I didn't want to break him. I wanted to rebuild something stronger, through honesty, through accountability. But the truth would hurt before it healed. And his parents, well, they were about to discover that I do not shrink from confrontation. I prepare for it. Especially when the numbers are on my side. When Nora and Frank arrived that evening, they walked in with the self-assured air of people who believed they were owed generosity. Nora hugged me with forced warmth. Frank made a comment about the weather. Daniel lingered behind me, guilt swallowing him whole. I invited them to sit at the dining table. On it lay the binder I had prepared, closed but unmistakably present. I'd like to go over the details of the transfer Daniel made last week, I began. Immediately, Nora's face shifted, defensive, preemptively wounded. Oh, Margaret, sweetheart, we meant to call you about that. We're so grateful. That's good to hear, I said calmly. Then this discussion shouldn't be difficult. I opened the binder. The first page, the transfer receipt. The second, their bank statement. The third, the expense breakdown. They stiffened. Nora's breath caught. This money, I continued, was described to Daniel as necessary for medical bills and essential repairs. Nora's lips parted into a tremble. Those were emergencies. Life is hard at our age. I slid the spa invoice forward. Was the Sedona resort part of that emergency? Silence. Frank shifted uncomfortably. We needed stress relief. I slid the cruise documentation next. And this. Nora clasped her hands dramatically. Margaret dear, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. I spoke gently, but with unmistakable precision. What I understand is that you knowingly misrepresented your circumstances to obtain money from my account. That is financial misconduct. I have spoken to a mediator, and this, I tapped the binder, is now a formal record. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Nora's expression hardened. The performance faded. So what are you saying? She asked coldly. You want us to grovel? Pay you back tomorrow? We can't do that. I'm not asking for that. I placed the repayment agreement on the table. I am treating this as a structured loan. You will repay the $65,000 over 4 years. 5% annual interest. Your monthly payments begin in 30 days. Nora's jaw dropped. A loan? To your own family? Yes, I said. Because family does not steal. Frank sputtered. This is ridiculous. You make plenty of money. And yet it was still mine, I replied. I worked for it. And I choose how it is used. Nora slammed her palm on the table. Daniel. Say something. Daniel lifted his head slowly, tears streaking down his cheeks. She's right, he said quietly. Mom. Dad. What you did was wrong. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Nora looked betrayed, hurt by the truth, not the wrongdoing. Frank looked furious, caught, unmasked. I remained calm. You will sign this agreement tonight, I said, or I will pursue civil recovery. And if you doubt I will, you don't know me at all. They glanced at each other, realizing they were cornered by nothing but facts. Slowly, reluctantly, with trembling hands, they signed. Not because they agreed, but because they had no choice. Once the papers were signed, Nora tried one last tactic. She softened her voice to honey and poison, the way she used to when she wanted Daniel to feel guilty. Margaret, dear, we didn't mean any harm. We just thought you wouldn't miss the money. I looked at her with quiet, unshakable clarity. That's the problem, Nora. You assume your wants are more important than other people's boundaries. But I am done enabling that belief. Frank crossed his arms. This is going to ruin our relationship. A relationship built on manipulation cannot be ruined by honesty, I replied. Daniel exhaled shakily. He looked at me with a mixture of shame and gratitude. I'm so sorry, he whispered. We'll deal with us later, I said. But tonight, you need to understand something. Your family has a pattern. And patterns don't change until consequences do. I turned back to his parents. I am not punishing you. I am holding you accountable. Frank scoffed. You're acting like a banker. I was one for 40 years, I said. And as of tonight, I am yours. They fell silent. I gathered the papers, slid them into the binder, and stood. This conversation is over. You may leave now. Nora stood slowly, eyes simmering with indignation. You'll regret this. Possibly, I said. But I won't regret standing up for myself. They walked out stiffly. The door closed with a hollow thud. Daniel remained at the table, his hands covering his face. I sat beside him and placed a gentle hand on his back. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I'm not hurt, I answered softly. I'm disappointed. But disappointment is something we can work through. Deception is not. He nodded, tears dripping silently. From now on, I continued, we have financial boundaries. Joint decisions only. Full transparency. And if your parents need help again, they come to me directly, with documentation. He swallowed hard. I agree. I lifted his chin so he'd look at me. I love you, I said. But love doesn't mean abandoning self-respect. It means protecting trust. He took my hand. I'll rebuild it. I promise. That night, we slept in the same bed, but with a space between us measured not in inches, but in truth. A necessary space. A healing space. The repayment began the next month. At first, Nora and Frank were indignant. Their first payment was late by a week, accompanied by a handwritten note about how unfair it all was. I didn't respond. I simply recorded the payment, logged the interest, and sent a polite reminder about future due dates. By the third month, they realized I wasn't wavering. By the sixth month, something remarkable happened. They began cutting their unnecessary expenses. They downsized their SUV. They cancelled their monthly massage subscription. They stopped treating Daniel like an ATM. Not because they had changed. Because they had to. Meanwhile, Daniel began therapy. Not for guilt, though he had plenty, but to untangle years of enmeshment. He learned to say no. He learned that love without boundaries becomes servitude. He learned that adulthood does not require sacrifice of self. Our marriage began to heal. One honest conversation at a time. One moment of transparency at a time. One slow step back toward partnership. A year into the repayment agreement, Nora called, not for money, but to apologize. A real apology. Quiet. Without excuses. We crossed a line, she admitted. I didn't see it before. I do now. I thanked her. Calmly. Kindly. But I did not loosen the agreement. Accountability doesn't dissolve simply because remorse appears. By the second year, their debt had become a normal part of their monthly obligations. They adjusted. They adapted. They learned responsibility late in life, but they learned it nonetheless. And my trip to the Scottish Highlands? I took it the following summer. Daniel stayed home at my suggestion, not as punishment, but so I could reclaim the experience that had been taken from me. I stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, wind whipping through my hair, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Not just financial. Emotional. The freedom that comes from knowing you defended yourself peacefully, ethically, and firmly. The freedom that comes from confronting, not avoiding, the truth. I am 62 years old, and life has taught me many lessons. But this experience taught me one of the most important. Generosity without boundaries becomes exploitation. Trust without accountability becomes permission. And silence in the face of disrespect becomes consent. My husband and I rebuilt our marriage through honesty, not avoidance. Through clarity, not appeasement. Through difficult conversations, not comfortable silence. His parents learned that adulthood does not end at retirement, and financial responsibility is not optional simply because someone else is willing to carry the weight. As for me, I learned that calm, documented truth can be the sharpest form of justice. You don't need to shout. You don't need to seek revenge in the shadows. You don't need to play their game. You simply need to stand firm, speak clearly, and let facts do the work. That is ethical revenge. That is dignified protection. That is how you reclaim power without losing your humanity. If you're listening to this story and you've ever been taken advantage of financially, by family, by a partner, by anyone, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to draw boundaries. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to demand respect. And you are allowed to enforce consequences. Kindness and firmness are not opposites. They are partners. And they protect you far better together than alone. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want more like this, true, calm, ethical tales of justice, let me know.